Okay, so welcome everybody. We're continuing sort of our series of the Pathwork cosmology lectures, and so this is the third in the series, lecture number 21, and it's on the fall. So a lot of this series is kind of about the, you know, experience of, creation and then the fall of the angels and then the plan of salvation. So this is going more deeply. Last time we talked about, the plan of creation and, like the whole process of, the beginning of the fall, right? So then he goes more in detail into the fall here. So he says, like to look at the last two lectures if you're new to coming into this one. So he says, "Greetings in the name of the Lord. Blessed are all of you, my dear friends. Last time I talked about how evil came into existence. This question has bothered many people who cannot imagine how a God of love could permit the existence of evil. For those friends who are here for the first time, I suggest they read the last two lectures in order to understand this one, which is a continuation. To briefly recapitulate, I explained how long before the existence of the material world, some of the created beings who had been endowed not only with free will, but also with a certain power, abused this power. I explained how this fall of the angels, as it is called, happened gradually as a slow process of degeneration, whereby everything divine very slowly and gradually turned into its opposite aspect. In this way, a separation occurred between those who had abused their power and those who had not. I have often said, and this applies to all beings, spirit or human, that your attitudes, your opinions, your feelings, and your thoughts create the spiritual worlds, even though you may still live on earth. You each create the world which will be yours. In the same way, the spirits participating in the fall created new worlds according to their changing attitudes. Dark worlds, often referred to as hell. The attitudes of disharmony and hatred created such forms. So is there any discussion on any of that?
I'm a little curious on the phrase, you each create a world which will be yours as opposed to is ours.
Yeah, I caught that as well, and I think in some ways both are true, but I think he says somewhere else, that sort of, like this life will determine our future life, both in the afterlife, and probably for future incarnation. So, in that sense, and then also because cause and effect are a little separated, it's like there may be an implication of that, like what's going on inside of us now gets, eventually projected out and mirrored back, right? And we get into a vicious circle or stuck in those spheres of consciousness in some sense. So, but yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. And then another thing that I thought, like up here where he talks about this abuse of power, and I think he goes into it a little more later, but, it's like everyone was endowed with this free will, but also with a certain power, and that power was abused. And so, I kind of wonder, like, what power, in the fall, you know, like, or that began the fall, was like our divine power that we abused in some way. Because he says again, the separation occurred between those who abused their power and those who had not.
How
And
about the power of persuasion?
okay, yeah, I would say even stronger than that, maybe, like where, we are attempting to, control another person with, even without their consent. So we're, like we're manipulating them, we're forcing them, we're, in this kind of refusal to allow like their free will. And we're also, where we apply that to our own self. I think, there's an abuse of power that we have towards our own self in that idealized self image, right? That is trying to control us, manipulate us, you know, make us be a certain way. And so I would say, that life, and that we have power, but there's something about this power that develops and grows organically, or it's the power of working with the whole or with spirit, or the power of love, in union. There's different, ways that, like when we try to control, all of the divine aspects of power seem to get lost, and power just becomes, something that we have to fight against, take down, I mean, right now, even in the world, like the power of the kind of overstructure, is what people are, trying to find a way beyond or through or to topple or whatever, depending on your situation.
Yeah, it's easier. I think for me, it's easier to understand those types of controlling and persuasive power in the material world. I have a hard time kind of grasping the idea that spirits would be vying for power and persuasion without some material gain to go along with it. But then you just think about, okay, I just need maybe some spirits needed other spirits to just be, I don't know, on their side more than they just couldn't let couldn't let people be, couldn't let spirits be, so to speak. I don't know. It's difficult to it's just difficult to imagine all of that going on without some material gain being the ultimate objective, you know?
Interesting. Yeah, I had never kind of thought of it that way, but I think, I mean, like this is where, in most of the spiritist stuff, I think the understanding, that the guide says with the negative specialists and everything is that there isn't like a mirror image, like of the negative, that was the positive divine qualities, and that in that same way there's hierarchy, and in that same way there is like sort of the intention, like the light, they don't like it, makes them hurt in some way, right? That they, I mean, I guess it's misery loves company, right? It's like, let's bring everything down, to our level or something. I don't know, but there's some implied motivation, I guess, of wanting to defeat, the light,
But
right?
wasn't the original implied motivation jealousy?
Yeah, I mean, that was the original cause, I think, of the beginning of
Everything was
separation.
distorted from there, perhaps? Everything was distorted from jealousy.
Not only jealousy, but again, going back to, sort of this, like a kind of, I've talked about this before, but so he talks about, Lucifer was being jealous of Christ, but he also says in another place that the very first thought that caused the fall was the justice of God is not just.
Oh, right. Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
And I think that, kind of nails it, right? It's like, and that's often where, it's like, this is, like the worldly justice, right? Seems unjust. And like, so what's God's justice? Or maybe is God's justice what is, right? But there is this, place of what the guide is saying, in the spiritual, like, there's that pain of injustice lecture, is that there really isn't any such thing. And again, if we take what he's saying in this lecture and others, that we're really, responsible for these worlds that we're creating, right? It's like, there is some form of co-creation. There is a combination of light and dark admixed, in the creation of our realms and worlds, and that includes like the physical planet, the earth plane, but it also includes each one of our own spheres of consciousness that we live in and carry with us and kind of flip-flop between, because we all have different uh, like states that we've moved throughout our lives. Some of them, kind of like more familiar and constant and repeating than others, right? But if we can begin to realize, oh, these are like spheres of uh, consciousness and worlds that I'm creating from this place of my attitude, of my feeling, of my story, right? And we begin to recognize that creative aspect of that, and also that we're spinning this story, so that's cause and effect. No wonder we feel like we're living in this suffering soup. So um, when we can see how we are creating these worlds, uh, then there's some process that can begin to illuminate and take us out of the darkness. But he's saying, like in the original fall, really, that those spirits participating in the fall, they created new worlds according to their changing attitudes, and then gradually got darker and darker and darker and darker, right? And so that's where we have these worlds sometimes referred to as hell, in the attitudes of disharmony and hatred create such forms. And I've also heard that, like the souls, get distorted into demonic looking creatures out of the, sort of energetic expression of this hatred and disharmony, right? That they're experiencing and expressing. So he says this is not just one possibility. There is not just one possibility in this respect, like many different levels. So let us suppose, for instance, that a being in its perfect state had a particular characteristic of great strength of love, the fire of divine love. This love force would turn around into its opposite and create a fire of hatred and wickedness. And thus, a very disharmonious kind of fiery world would come into existence. So you see, all legends are not as unreal as they might appear to you. Let us suppose another individual in his or her perfect state of development had the particular characteristic of wise judgment, calmness, and detached reflection. These attributes would enable the being to further divine creation in a particular way through the slow unfoldment of this special creative power. Yet directed to its opposite force, this power would recreate a world of icy coldness, icy darkness, and desolation. So, these are kind of extreme examples, but there are many more possibilities of how the infinite variety of divine attributes can change into their opposites and create the corresponding spheres in the world of darkness, of which there is also an infinite variety, just as in the divine world. These spheres of fire or icy coldness in the spiritual sense, of course, are just two examples. There are spheres of slime and dirt, spheres of intense suffering through overcrowding or through isolation, and many other varieties. And in a sense, like we think, oh, well, that's a state of after life, and it can be, but it's also a state in life, where we live in those spheres here on earth, right? Of slime, dirt, intense suffering, and overcrowding, isolation, right? So there's not so much difference in some way if we can understand that. Any comments there?
Well, it kind of looked like, excuse me, to me that everything in the universe has to have an opposite to exist. So, sorry. So if the love is the sense of the center of the universe, does that mean there has to be evil to back that to have love? There has to be dark to have light, or light to have dark. Does that make sense?
I mean, there's some of this in here. I mean, but I think it's a kind of a deep question. Like I remember, like there's really, like like there's the absence of light, right? Dark is not something in and of itself. It's the absence of light, right? And so I think there is a way that there is also, in this world of duality, and he talks about this also, that we do experience, the both sides. And I think, in physical reality, it's more like the Tao, where yes, there is day and there is night, and they are complementary opposites, right? And so most opposites are probably like that. But from our human perspective, where some things then might be more pleasurable than others, then we split the world into duality. And then we fight against one, and try to control the world to make it be only one side, which only creates more, splits and complexity and, evil in a sense. So, we're really trying to come back, I think, into that more unified spirit of opposites here on earth. And maybe, in the spiritual plane beyond that, there might be levels that does not exist. But certainly here, and he talks about even our humanness, right, is composed of 50-50, right? And so, it's my experience, everything that's created on this earth plane has good sides and bad sides. I mean, we were all jived about the internet, now we got all these, so it seems like anything that arises immediately has, both good and bad to it. And sort of the child consciousness gets, instead of accepting that reality and learning how to like work with it somehow, or I don't know what exactly it leads to. But I notice we try to control one and eradicate the other or whatever, and I don't think it really ever works. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but it poses a question, and a puzzle on the blackboard for us to kind of try to penetrate.
Just doesn't it come down to choice eventually? Just both sides are there.
Yeah, and you could say, well, we have free will and we want to choose the light versus the dark, and maybe we don't. And that's true, I think, in a certain level. But, like I also see, like even in those choices sometimes, right, there's distortion in divinity almost in everything. And the other thing is that we don't want to get rid of anything, right? So again, he talks about perfection here, but in the Bible, my understanding is that word, really comes from a Greek translation of the word whole, right? Be ye whole as your Father in heaven is whole. So wholeness has to encompass both sides of the polarities. So, I think that there's some kind of koan here that we're working with in a way, right? To understand, um, how affirming, like, love and the positive, but holding, everything else within that. I mean, I think it's a part of like the whole, reason why, God had to, create the plan of salvation, was so that not one spirit, not even the deepest, darkest, most evil, vilest, being would be, forever separated from God. So there's a way in which, the love of God is this totally inclusive, calling back of everything to itself. Um, and, that has to be this huge embrace. And I think, it's what Christ sort of demonstrated as well, right? Not easy for the ego at all to do, but in some way, within our each of our own being, awakening that Christ within us, I think is to make, an inquiry into these deep questions about, you know, confronting good and evil. And maybe, I mean, maybe again, most important is the choice to follow God's will, right? And then, what is God's will? Well, I think in the best thing we can do in this plane, any way of existence, is to assume that what is part of God's will, right? It may be, also our co-creation, right? But God is allowing us to co-create this for our edification in some way. And so, there's an alignment, right? And we are experiencing. Hi, Teresa, welcome.
Hi, Darlene. Thanks.
So we're just kind of in the middle of the lecture.
I'm sorry I'm late.
That's okay. Yeah. It's like, so we're just talking about, like this way that all of these, divine aspects turned into their opposites, and, how the, power of the embracing or the wholeness, right? And the free will and all of that is so significant to all of this. So let me go ahead and I'll just start reading from here now, and we'll. So he says, since one of the most important divine aspects is free will or freedom of choice, this had to turn into its opposite too. And the spirit, who was the first to succumb to the temptation of abusing this power, so this is the power of free will, and I think that's what we're talking. The one who is sometimes referred to as Lucifer, Satan, or the devil, who influenced others to follow him, would naturally have been the first one to inhabit the new world that came into existence. And then, like the guide makes this, leap in, or like the statement that so, like being the first one in this new world, this spirit had complete power over all those who followed him. And contrary to God, he used this power. So God gives the freedom of choice. And this has deeper significance than most of you realize. With that freedom necessarily comes the possibility to abuse the given power and to use it contrary to the divine laws. So to use our will, contrary to divine laws. If no choice were available, there would be no freedom and no power. And there can be no divine happiness, in fact, no divinity at all, if it cannot be attained or maintained by free choice. By the same token, the opposite of God and his laws must be the prohibition of free choice and the domination of the stronger over the weaker ones. So there's a lot, in that piece there, I think. So anybody want to offer anything? So we had talked a little bit before about how, like the energy inside of us that tries to control us, right? With forcing current, with, moralizing, with, all of that, right? Could be equivalent. Does that make sense? So, there's a part of us that, doesn't give us free will and abuses, this power of domination inside of us. And then, of course,
That's what comes to mind for me, Darlene, is like the idea that, like when you were reading up a little higher where it said, let me see, since one of the most is free will or free choice to turn the opposite, it turns into the opposite. And I always, a lot of times, the way I read these things is not as different outside people, but what's going on inside of me, like when I see the different parts.
yeah.
So I know, like when I was working really hard on this one thing, I remember thinking, I can't see the choice. Like I don't see a choice. I feel like it has to be a certain way. And when you can't see the choice, then that's the opposite of free will. Like you feel like you don't have a choice. And that's all going on in this little micro world inside myself, in addition to the macro, right? Because the whole thing is all within us. So that's what really comes to me. And then when you have these breakthroughs where you feel like you can see the choice, that's the miracle. When you think you have no choice, that you have to feel a certain way, you have to think a certain way, or you can't see the other way out. But then all of a sudden,
Exactly. I don't know. I'm getting a strange echo, so I don't know.
from me.
I don't know. Seems like it's better now.
Okay.
So, yeah. So, Exactly. And I think one other way that that free will thing comes in, I like, that lecture that the guide has on the no current and the yes current, because, there's this way that, our resistance then has a certain divinity. Does that
Mm,
make sense? Like we can't, even though we might spiritually know better in one part of us, if we try to force ourselves to act that way when there's some resistance inside of us, right? Then we're again, sort of abusing that power within us, and we're not recognizing, that resistance needs to also have choice. And maybe we can, go in deeper and understand it, and have the self-knowledge, where we recognize, like you said, a new choice out of that, where we recognize that, the fear that we were holding on to isn't necessarily real or something like that. And so again, that free will opens up, and we can choose, and we have to do it from deep within. We can't kind of try to superimpose from our ISI into our complex living being with all of its different levels. uh, but we can be conscious, of all of these things, and sort of work inside in this sort of gradual way that he's talking about. The fall happens, there's this gradual process of, regaining and reaffirming and choosing, the light. If no choice were available, there would be no freedom and no power. So, it's also this place where, we couldn't be like God, right? This is part of where free will is something that is an attribute of the divine, of God. And for us to be like the divine, I think this was maybe in the other lecture, like we have to, be able to vibrate, or, live in that energy, right? And that requires that, we have this free will capacity. Otherwise, we couldn't be like God, and therefore, we wouldn't know that state of godliness, or, true perfection. So, if no choice were available, there would be no freedom and no power. There can be no divine happiness, in fact, no divinity at all, if it cannot be attained or maintained by free choice. By the same token, the opposite of God and his laws must be the prohibition of free choice and the domination of the stronger over the weaker. This state of affairs would seem to make the salvation of fallen beings impossible. For even should they have come to the point of desiring to go back to God, they would not have the power to do so, since they were under the dominion and power of the one who reigns in the world of darkness. So this is where, he's kind of saying that, like, so we were, this being that didn't allow free will, that we followed, right? So we were kind of trapped in this rubric, cube, or, this kind of thing where we couldn't really have free will in this situation. And so on the other hand, how could God not break his own laws and still save the beings that longed for him? So after a while in the fall, we started longing back for the light of God, and there was this way that we were trapped on this side. And if he just set us free, or whatever, like, that would violate free will. So uh, there was this way that if he were to use his infinite power by overruling the free will and the choice of those who decided to use the given power in their own way, he would actually be acting from the same principle as Lucifer. Right? Does that make sense? So here, more than anything else, maintaining the divine principle was of utmost importance. For only if God remained true to himself and his laws would there be a fundamental difference between the ways of God and the ways of Lucifer. And since it's God's plan that every creature should recognize him and at one time come back to him out of free choice and re-attain divinity, it was imperative that he not use the same means of force as his opponent, even though his purpose might be a good one. And we can recognize this in our world too, right? And oftentimes, good movements, turn bad because they start using the wrong means, right? So it is not the end alone that counts, but very much the means too. Only by remaining true to these principles would the most stubborn of the fallen beings one day see the vast difference between these two ways of being and understand the dignity that lies in the divine principles, even though it means a path of suffering for those who wish to get out of the self-created miserable circumstances. Since life in spirit is in direct relationship to the inner harmony, enlightenment, and general attitude, spirits who have become disharmonious cannot be simply put into a world of harmony as you might travel into a beautiful country. I think this is a really good kind of analogy or, understanding here, because we think, well, let's just, even in our kind of social efforts and psychological efforts, we think, if we just change their environment or, whatever, we can, bring them into more health. And it's true, that people are more healthy in healthy environments. But the guide is saying here, it's like the person's, country, so to speak, is a reflection of their energetic level. And so in the world of spirit, the country is both you and your product. Therefore, the once fallen spirits had and still have to attain a state where again they naturally produce harmonious worlds. That this can only be accomplished through the same slow process of development as the fall with its degeneration is natural enough. You will readily understand now that this must happen in free choice, too, so that questions like, why has God not done away with evil, need not come up anymore in your deliberations. Is that, do you see, like, because it's often, like a human confusion, right? Like, does that make sense to you guys? Like, in this whole kind of understanding of the process here that we're going through. And technically, again, God could just, probably wave his magic wand or whatever, but it would be violating, a whole, slew of things that, and now, in some ways, the evil that we're creating has to become the medicine for us to return. And on the other hand, means had to be found so that the creatures who desired to return to God and to keep his laws instead of Lucifer could do so within the framework of the laws of God. Thus, the free will of no one would be broken, not even of Lucifer himself. And this is the great plan of salvation in which Christ played a major role. And I will talk about this in more detail the next time. So, this puzzle was, like after the fall was sort of present, like how could God, help all beings return when they were ready to, and not violate free will, but also leave the door open even for Lucifer himself. And because there was this issue of Lucifer not giving free will to other souls, right? We couldn't be influenced by the light. We couldn't have the experience of the light. And so there was something that had to kind of take place in the spiritual realm, and it had to take place in a way that would not violate the free will of this Luciferic consciousness. So this is our next 2 weeks. We'll be, working with the plan of salvation. So he continues, the spheres of darkness first came into existence, where the spirits lived under the dominion of Lucifer. In the beginning, there was no longing for or sense of the light they had once possessed. Only after tasting the self-chosen medicine for a considerable time, that is, experiencing a state of desolation, did a vague longing for something else, they did not know quite for what, take hold of some of these beings. It goes without saying that the memory of God and his worlds was extinguished to the degree that disharmony had set in, but it was revived again as attitudes changed. The latter could only occur as an exceedingly slow process, however. Spiritual darkness annuls knowledge, which is spiritual light. Just as with human beings, if you have no spiritual enlightenment, you have to work spiritually to regain glimpses of this light. Sometimes I think of this also in ways where, even in the, sort of psychopathic element, or, real criminal element, there's this connection with family or with tribe or with, this, and usually it's a distorted, like projection of their identification onto everybody else. But there is sort of this growing beginning of, like connecting with others. And I think that has something to do with somehow, this awakening to getting developed enough to have this longing, right, for something more. And also just, the void. Right? I can imagine, like I know in my own darkest places, right, that was the depth of the pain of what I felt, was this sort of almost unrequited longing, right, this deep longing that knew that there was something more but didn't know how to reach it. So, and that longing can be a source of suffering, uh, and I think there is a way when, we have a image about it, like from childhood, right? Maybe we longed, and of course it never got met, and so we came to the conclusion inside that, our longing was never going to be met. Then, then there's distortion in that longing too, because it comes with this assumption. And I think that was a part of what I would feel, was this kind of twisted, real longing that also, was real need and painful. But then there was this other distorted, twisted pain that, said, somehow it was out of reach, or I couldn't have it. So the vague longing that first some and later more creatures felt was sufficient to bring a glimmer of light into their world, as though a faraway dawn changed the contours of their world a little bit. And the cold would not be quite so cold anymore, and the fire not so hot anymore, the filth not so quite so filthy, and the loneliness not quite so unbearable and hopeless anymore. And when enough spirits came into the state of longing, and the longing increased, the time was ripe for the material world as you know it to come into existence. So if you think about this, scientifically almost, it's like, it's like at the beginning of the, like after the fall, sort of like maybe the Big Bang occurs as the beginning of the plan of salvation. But like how many billions of years did it take before, like our world, the earth plane, right, came into existence, so that we could, begin this incarnational journey. And maybe there was, incarnation in other forms prior to that, through, but there's a kind of interesting, sense of how many, how the vastness of time that we were maybe lost, if you think of it in terms of the, beginning of the cosmos and to today. So you may say that God created the material world, and this is true, for nothing can be created without the creative divine force. However, it is equally true that the material world was also created by the longing of enough spirits for something higher. The world in which you are now living is the product of the desire to strive higher. Here conditions exist in which spiritual development can proceed, and in which a free choice for God can be made, which is impossible in the worlds of darkness. In other words, this earth sphere is a product of the longing of the fallen spirits, and it is equally a product of the longing of all those beings who remained with God, and whose deepest desire was always and is always to bring their brothers and sisters back to God. Therefore, both the divine worlds and the worlds of darkness helped in the creation of this earth sphere. The influence of both worlds exists and will manifest itself according to the attitude of each individual being on this plane possessing the power of free choice. Conditions and circumstances on this earth sphere are different, of course, due to the new form of matter, but then circumstances vary in all spheres. Long before the fallen spirits developed far enough to be born as men and women, the spiritual life force first acted to create other forms of life. The original life force that works and manifests itself in each created being not only produced animals, plants, and minerals, but also other substances which were at first without self-awareness. Just as a plant is without self-awareness, so too were these substances. And as time went on, more and more beings came into a state of longing for light. And I think even, like, I don't know, I question sometimes, the guide when he talks about animals and nature, I don't know if also nature is being illuminated and awakening, but I think, there's more self-awareness in plants than we know about, and also in animals. So maybe everything is waking up as we are, or maybe, we've been in a deeper state of slumber and they have had a certain connection with sort of unitive consciousness, even in a less self-conscious way, perhaps, they didn't have an individualized self so much. But, I think they are aware and sentient. So it may depend on how you think about that. But I always have to make a little disclaimer about when he talks about how dumb the rest of nature is, because I'm not sure I really agree with that. Very gradually, human beings came into existence in material form through various intermediate states. When this happened, a major phase was accomplished. This was the time when the first glimmer of self-awareness was born or reborn or reawakened. More and more people came to live on Earth only with self-awareness, which includes thinking and deciding, can development take place. Choice again. All the forms of life which existed before human beings have been leading up to this point. And then that free will implies, trial and error. We have to learn. And we learn from sometimes the wrong choice, right? But that's how learning takes place if we don't get sidetracked by the negative voices, right? That then try to deny, the learning in some way by making us wrong and bad and therefore unworthy, and therefore, hopeless to change things instead of the positive potential for learning that is so inherent in our being. I mean, the human being is a learning machine in so many ways, right? And so if we got out of our own way, we could learn so quickly, I think, so many things. And seeing them more neutrally and understanding them from a deeper perspective instead of like always the ego mind sort of defending its territory and trying to fix itself or control others or whatever. Any comments? I've been going rambling on for a while here.
What comes up for me, always comes up for me, is the amount of time in our time that it took. I mean, if we think that, if we believe and know that the universe is 13.7 billion years old and that matter was created for this purpose 13.7 billion years ago, and human beings have really only been conscious, really conscious entities for what, 20,000 years maybe at the most. It's a lot of time, a lot of evolution going on there, endless time and evolution. And so how do you put that into perspective?
I mean, it does, and it feels like, he's saying that, there was a lot of darkness in those realms. But I don't know. I also think, like the whole development of the galaxies and the natural world. Like I like cosmologies that really talk about this, dance in the universe. And so I don't know if that's the same thing as the darkness, but I think, yeah, the souls, we already had fallen, and maybe we were in the darkest places all that time while, the cosmos was, trying to, be created to get to the place where, this world could exist, and our longing could, bring us to this planet. So yeah, I also have that sense. Now, you know,
It
time is a kind
also,
of relative thing, I guess, at many levels, and so it's hard to completely, understand that. And he talks about I think in that other lecture we did last week, sort of the negative side of eternity, being this total materialism, and stuck in, dense, rock material, like, or mechanical kinds of, things. So, I think again, we're, often he just talks about there's like different spheres everywhere. It's kind of like every possibility in the universe of, states and consciousness and being exist in some way. Um, the mini mansion kind of theory that, and so all of this has, yeah, taken this long time to develop. And yeah, I don't know exactly, when you say we're conscious, if we are even conscious yet. But
giving us the benefit of the doubt,
right.
darling.
I
It
think,
also speaks to the eternal nature of your soul. I mean, if you could
exactly.
somehow wrap your head around the idea that your soul is even older than the universe.
Yeah. And eternity is really outside of time, and so this is a concept that I don't think while we're incarnate we can fully grasp.
Probably
So,
not.
um, but yeah, I think that, certainly for me, it does, like, like, so this was a long, slow journey of devolution and then gradual evolution that's been happening, and I think maybe the devolution happened before the Big Bang, and it's been this gradual, slow evolution since the beginning of the Big Bang as possible, so. And again, the two systems may not totally correlate, but that's often what I see too, Frank, is kind of the idea that matter and the material universe was created, for this purpose of salvation.
Hmm.
Yeah, like as we talk about this too, the one thing that occurs to me is, sometimes I can be hard on myself as far as like, well, it's so slow. It just takes, I'm in my friggin' 60s now and I'm still working on stuff that I recognized, in my 30s. Like what is taking so long, but then when you think about the big picture of time, it's, uh, it doesn't really matter, kind of.
Yeah,
It's
no, exactly.
it feels slow, but it's not really slow. I don't know. Slow, fast, what does that even mean?
Exactly. I think, there's that. And just even, when he often talks about how many lifetimes it takes for,
Right,
like this learning to happen. And, as I've gotten older, I mean, I think there is this kind of impatience, and, time is different when you're younger,
right,
and
totally.
it does feel like, it feels good to accept a little bit more patience and understanding of sort of the long reaches of development like that.
Yeah,
Trust that I don't have to do it all right now, or I'm
right.
how.
It's okay, right where it is for a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we might be going very fast at the same time. So
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I had in my other group that I do in New York, somebody once said, well, I want the fast track. And somebody said, well, this is the fast track. Doing path work is the fast track. If you weren't doing this, it would be a lot slower.
Exactly, exactly.
So, because at least we're in the this idea that we're trying to help it along, like we're
Right, consciously
participating.
cooperating.
Yeah,
Exactly.
cooperating rather than just like sort of letting it happen whenever, it feels
Yeah,
like
I
it.
think, I think it's happening no matter what, but we get to a certain
Right.
level of development and then we're more consciously aware of what's happening and trying to happen, and then we can actively participate, and that does accelerate, I think
Yeah.
is exactly what he's saying. And it still will, may take a lifetime at least, and probably more. Sorry, I have a little rhinitis, so I don't know where it's coming from. I think just the dryness in the air, maybe now.
Omicron.
Yeah, don't say that. I mean, it could be, I guess, if I'm vaccinated.
Sorry, I couldn't resist. I'm like in healthcare.
Yeah. Is that one of the symptoms of it?
A runny nose is actually one of the
One of
main
the symptoms.
symptoms of Omicron.
I've had this
Unless you
off and
already
on.
have Huh?
I've had this off and on. I mean, this is like the third bout of it I've had,
Oh,
over the last 3 months or so. So
oh,
it seems to be something coming and going. So maybe it is Omicron, but I don't, like
yeah.
this seems to be a worse example of it. But
Well, that's what two of my colleagues got it, and the one girl was like, "My nose wouldn't stop running. I was just running and running." So
interesting.
anyway, for what it's worth.
Who knows? Everybody's probably going to get it eventually the way it's going. And the vaccines don't seem to be, any, they help for sure, but so I'm boosted in everything. So
The vaccines are
not out
working.
there much. So if that's what it is, I guess, I'm supposed
The
to get
only
it.
people in the hospital for COVID are unvaccinated
That's
people.
right. The
All I'm
vaccines are
gonna say.
working, Darlene. Yes, they are.
Yeah, I don't want to get it, period, though. I don't know what the damn things got down the road. Oh, well. I still don't know. I mean, it is kind of puzzling to determine, what's a cold, what's, my allergic rhinitis, what's COVID, who knows. So anyway, how did the influence of the world of God manifest itself? Could angels of God guide and inspire the human beings who were incarnated from the spheres of darkness? This would be an impossibility since, according to universal law, an individual human being has to make the first step in order to receive help from the world of God. How could this step be made if the whole entity was still so coarse that it had no inkling of God, no idea of his world, and no notion of what to do? On the other hand, God's world co-created this material earth, and thus, according to the law of free will, had the right to manifest its influence on earth. So the answer is that pure spirits who remained in the divine worlds were incarnated at all times. To be sure, very few were incarnated at one time, but the influence of one such being outweighs by far the strength and influence of 100 creatures of the world of darkness. The spirits who were incarnated from the world of God brought with them light, love, and wisdom. They fulfilled a great mission with their incarnation on earth, and their influence was much more far-reaching than might have appeared at first sight. With this influence growing steadily through the ages, the fallen spirits during their incarnation on earth could freely choose what side to listen to, the side that reached their lower nature or the side that seemed to push them ever upward, regardless of the difficulties encountered. By such free choice, God's law concerning this aspect of life was not violated. Communication with the beyond took place not only through guidance and inspiration, but what always existed and what will exist through a more direct form of communication, namely what you now call mediumship in various forms. Communication with spheres of the beyond depends entirely on the attitude, goal, and general development of the medium, as well as of the people using the channel. During early times, human beings who were fallen spirits could not have any communications other than with the world of darkness. But the pure incarnated spirits had communication with the world of God, and this so strongly outweighed the danger and the damage of communication with the Luciferic worlds that it was indeed worthwhile. If communication with one world could exist, a connection with the other was within the law. And if one had been impossible, then the other would have been equally impossible. Incidentally, this is where some human beings make a great mistake when they reason that any communication with the beyond is luciferic and dangerous, and even claim that it is the only possible one. Human development could not have proceeded at all in those early times if pure spirits who were occasionally incarnated could not have made a very direct connection with the world of God from which truth could come to humanity. To have this benefit and remain within the framework of the divine law, an equality had to exist so that each individual could make a free choice. An equal influence had to come from both sides. This meant fewer beings of the divine world living on earth, because their strength always outweighs and outlasts the influence of evil. However, especially during the early times, a great interchange existed between the material and the luciferic worlds. The dark spirits claimed to be gods and to favor human beings with all sorts of grants if they in turn would follow what the luciferic spirits dictated. Despite all this harm and danger, the few communications which were established with the world of God made up for the damage 100 times over. The incarnated pure spirits had enough enlightenment within themselves to spread divine truth, as well as the necessary requirements to be in communication with the world of God as instruments. For without the mediumistic connection, not enough truth could have been given to humanity. Even though the pure spirits had no evil in them, the material shell of a body took so much energy away that the teachings coming from within their own selves would not have been sufficient. Truth was spread in the manner that humanity at each particular period was ready to absorb. Thus, this went on for a long time. Gradually, more of the once fallen spirits came into the state where they could recognize God. Their longing became conscious and meaningful. Their will could now be developed to overcome the evil impulses of their lower nature. The change that began to take place had a much greater effect than can be easily realized. Not one of you fully understands that if a single person develops really well, doing the best in his or her power, this person does not only help himself, but adds the most valuable cosmic power to a great reservoir. It will ultimately have a very decisive effect that will spread considerably, even though the person may not even see a part of this effect. As people change, they might see some of the effect in their immediate surroundings by noticing how all of a sudden their fellow creatures begin to change a little bit due to their own change. But people will not know as long as they are on earth how far-reaching the effect of the smallest endeavor in this direction is. No such endeavor is therefore ever in vain, my friends. So just take that in a minute.
Yeah, that's huge. That passage there is, because sometimes we feel that we're not making a difference, we're not getting anywhere, we're not, I don't know, we're stuck, but we're
And
making
and
we're
you know,
making
we
more of
think
a
it's just a
difference.
little. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Frank.
Just by being on the path, we're making more of a difference than we realize,
Right. Yeah, and it's sometimes, like hard to recognize I think, like even the slightest little things that we do out of, the higher self and intention and, with guidance or presence or whatever like that, like I think there is this, he's talking about here a ripple effect, right? That goes way beyond what we can possibly understand. So, um, yeah, it's like to know that we matter, that we count, and all of the little efforts that we're making, not only for our own, I mean, a lot of people come to the pathwork to escape their own suffering, right? And it works that way, but it's more than that, and we are, helping become part of this great plan of salvation. And so this kind of concludes, his part about, this fall. he goes into some Q&As, and there's one that's quite extensive about, see if I can find, this is it here, uh, self-knowledge, and then another one also on will and control, oh yeah, this one, yeah, was willpower and self-control. So it's 8:40. Let's go ahead and go a little further, into this, but it kind of shifts in terms of the topics connected, but almost like this is another lecture in a way that came out of this question that someone asked during a Q&A. So he says, last time you answered the question about willpower and self-control, I think it is important to see oneself in one's true reality to achieve self-understanding in order to improve oneself. But how can one attain this self-knowledge? This is a very good and very important question indeed. He answers, of course, I speak a great deal about this when I work privately and also treat it occasionally in general lectures, but it's so basic and important that it cannot be stressed enough. As you rightly say, before willpower and self-control can be strengthened, again, this is that, like we try to make ourselves, or the forcing current, or this sort of control issue of the ISI, right? And so this is the difference between that attempt at control and sort of this inner choice, right? Inner intentionality, and a different kind of willpower than the outer willpower. So he says we have to really establish that inner choice and inner intentionality and inner will. It requires the self-knowledge. So as to have a clear-cut idea, of why we want to develop our attributes, what is the goal, what is the direction that the willpower and self-control can be utilized. And in order to have willpower, the goal has to be cleared in your mind. Yet to find out your true goals and wishes, and most important of all, to gain self-knowledge, you definitely need some willpower already to begin with. Thus, the process works both ways. The first step in the proper order is to establish what the issues are, why it is necessary to have self-knowledge, what are its advantages, how costly is it to attain, what are the disadvantages of not having it. Once you clearly understand this, you can make the proper decision. You will gain clear understanding if you set out to think about it objectively, disregarding the resistances of your lower nature. All you have to do is not shirk the issue and think things through to the end of the road. This is not so difficult. It merely requires a little bit of courage and wisdom. Everybody has some courage and wisdom within. It is only a question of letting it come to the surface. As with willpower here too, it is a question of deciding, of making up one's mind once and for all. This can be done only by considering all sides. The trouble with people is not that they cannot do this, but that they avoid those decisions concerning their inner life. They run away from them, sensing it might be uncomfortable. They prefer to cover up the issue instead of viewing it with clear eyes and an open, unbiased mind, not pampering the lazy self that likes to wallow in the swamp of self-indulgence. So the why of the trouble and discomfort of self-knowledge has to be established. So, this is an example of a sentence, that like I know, when I read it, there's a kind of, feeling in my own being. I don't know if it's coming from the guide, like that there's a little forcing current, right? There, like, sort of this, I think there's a truth, that we do wallow in the swamp of self-indulgence. But again, it's kind of like we have to do that until we recognize that we are and choose to do something else, right? So to me, this kind of goes back to this just gradual process of self-recognition of understanding the trouble, the cost of it, right? Like recognizing, oh, I'm doing it this way. What does that cost? What does it gain me? That kind of thing. And so I think, we can again just, keep exploring ourselves from this simple, place of trying to understand, this willingness to really deeply, deeply understand all parts of us, and to, help ourselves unravel ourselves in a way. So he says the questions are not so difficult to answer for the person who knows that God exists, even if many facets of him and his creation are still ignored. Even if your belief is feeble, but you follow the thought to the end, the understanding must come that it is necessary to develop oneself. And self-development cannot be done without self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is the only thing that really counts, my friends. Nothing else is any good. Nothing else will ever bring you your development about, enable you to have real faith and real love for God above everything and for your fellow creatures as for yourself. You have to begin with yourself before you can attain the freedom and harmony you all long for in your innermost being. How to accomplish this? It's not easy, but its rewards are the richest. For this path is the only one that brings you liberation. So it is only logical that it cannot be easy. It means, in the first place, to be able to humble yourself. No one likes to hear that, my friends. Sometimes people actually confuse the word humble with, I think, humiliate yourself or feel humiliated or something, and it doesn't mean that at all. Um, you know, and yet, it is kind of a hard place to find, and yet it's so liberating when we do. Um, but it is kind of going beyond the self-will and the ego and the vanity that are sort of always comparing and always measuring themselves from the outer. And it kind of comes from establishing our own inner authority and the recognition that we are 50-50, right? That we contain the light, but also the darkness. And it's pretty much equal, right? And that we can, just accept this fact, and even understand that, it's part of the mission that we came in, bringing this darkness so that here on earth where it can be influenced by this light, by this, God, vibration and truth and love and all of that, we bring it in so that it can be exposed, to the goodness as well as, the potential of change. So without whatever the various individual faults can possibly be, like the hindrances, to these places of the divine, harmony, perfection, love, all of that, we just have to apply. I'm sorry, I've lost myself, so let me back up. No one likes to hear that, my friends, for self-will and ego and vanity exist in every human being and are the strongest hindrances to perfection, faith, harmony, and love. Whatever the various individual faults can possibly be, and this applies to each and every one who goes through the cycle of incarnations. In other words, everyone who is not a pure spirit, right? In other words, every one of us. If you want to gain self-knowledge, you have to reconcile yourself first to the idea, I have to do what is most difficult for me, right? That's what we came in to do. It's not a vacation, it's an initiation. We came in to try to face and go through, and the world will help us if we can't, if we can't do it consciously, which will make it easier, we kind of like will be pushed through it and may have to suffer, in ways that, we can't figure it out and resolve it even in this lifetime. But, we are up against sort of that wall inside of ourselves. And it's a key for, it is most difficult for you to show, having a weakness than to show what is just what your soul needs to struggle free of its chains. Let me try that again. If it is most difficult for you to show having a weakness, then to show that is just what your soul needs to struggle free of its chains. Or if it's difficult for you to give up your vanity or your selfishness, then that is where you should jump in freely because you choose so, not because life forces you. You see, my friends, the divine laws are made in such a way that the things you need come to you. but it will be so much easier if you meet them halfway. If you decide on your own accord, I want it because I obviously need it, and then step into it yourself. If life forces or pushes you into it against your will, it will not only be so much harder, but it will come to you again and again until you have learned through self-knowledge that you need what life gives you and to meet it freely yourself. I think this is very beautiful and important to take in. And then the lesson will be learned and life will have other things to offer you. The more purified you are by this process, the less you will need unpleasant experiences. Or rather, what used to seem unpleasant will not be so anymore. You cannot avoid what you need. That I can assure you. Until you have met it out of your own accord with the realization and understanding of its necessity for your character, it will not cease. Please remember that, all of you. In order to gain self-knowledge, you might, for instance, sit down and ask yourself, what is most difficult for me to do in my daily life? Perhaps for some of you, the most difficult thing will be to admit the truth, for whatever motive. For another, it might be humiliating to show yourself as you are without a mask and without the superiority with which you try to impress people. For yet another, it may be most difficult to be modest, to remain in the background. For another, to give something, whether materially or spiritually. Everyone has different difficulties, and each one of you can find out about them comparatively easily if you really try. You do not have to think very far. Think of your immediate reality, your life right now. View every day that passes from that point of view, and you will, after some trying and training, come to see your reactions quite differently, I assure you. You will learn to recognize emotional reactions that had been completely unaware of before. So yeah, I think, it's helpful, I think, to really recognize that life is giving us what we most need. And if we can use that as our guide, and then also, our self-knowledge and self-recognition, and step in to meet it, that really is, the best response to what arises, right? And that's a part of what we mean by self-responsibility. It's not only accepting, well, somehow we must have manifested this and understanding maybe how we did, but also the ability to respond to what it is. So here I'm, my issues are being reflected back to me. I'm encountering them, and if I can trust that life is not just being cruel or harsh or punishing me or arbitrary or whatever, but it's actually the exact lesson on the blackboard that I'm being invited into for my own, you know, greater capacity to unfold. And then it can be, even the most difficult things can be joyful. Any comment there?
Right on.
You know,
Your immediate, oh, go ahead, Frank.
there's a passage in lecture number 3 that talks about sort of this topic about using your willpower to actually work on these problems or tasks in your life. And the passage in lecture 3 says that the more you resolve yourself to do that, the more energy, the more life force comes to you to help you do that. The more you resist it, the less life force comes to you. It's like you charge or drain your own battery, so to speak,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
in that
Yeah.
way.
And then I think a lot of people kind of do something like, I think what I see a lot is, like, I mean, maybe people think, well, oh, I want to, you know, like take care of myself better or something, which is, in some ways a higher self. It could also be a mask
Mhm.
motive, but like, but then they try to, the application of will is the outer will, right? And I think the guide is talking in that lecture too about the willpower to meditate, right? And I think it has to be kind of not coming from, oh, my ISI says I should, right? But dropping out of the mental and the, alienated self into the heart and seeing, what do I want? What
Yeah.
do I really want? And choosing from there, right? And knowing, well, I maybe I don't want to meditate, but if I look at, well, if I don't, put that time in, like I don't have the benefits, and maybe I have some negative, or stress or difficulties, right? So then knowing that, like I have my free will, I choose not to meditate, but then I notice the consequences of that,
Right.
and then maybe the next time in my heart I change my mind, or I have a change of heart and I say, yes, I think I will. And then I'm choosing it from that inner willingness, right? And the guide also says, I think in that lecture, that if we don't have that, if we have an, resistance or negative, well, we can pray for the willingness, ask for the willingness, right? Because that's really where it needs to come from, and not from our outer willpower.
Right.
So the use of the word willpower here, I find, is a little confusing, because
Well, but lecture 3 is all about willpower, it seems.
yeah, but there's two kinds of willpower the guide talks about in the lectures. Do you remember that? And so, the outer will and the inner will. And so what he's talking about here is using the inner willpower and not the outer willpower. The outer
Right.
will always gets into trouble.
Right. Oh yeah, definitely. Inner willpower.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, to make it simple for me, it's like, I have some bad habits. I know they're bad habits. To muster up the inner will to change a habit, a bad habit, or discontinue a bad habit would be, the easiest example of it in my life. You know.
Yeah, and like you could maybe know theoretically that that's not so good for you and try to do it from there, but if you actually live the consequence, like a lot of times, for me, like sometimes feeling some of these emotional spheres that I create, right? And I don't know how to control it, right? But I recognize when, like, okay, so this is what it's manifesting, right? And so then I'm wanting to choose something different, and then I think Holy Spirit, other things come in to play, to help us and to, bring us that life force, because it's the choice, and not, even if I choose it and don't accomplish it, right? It's like, if I go back and recognize, why I didn't do that, the consequences of not doing that, and re-engage, my desire, my longing, my willingness, then, it moves it forward, right? And the trouble with sometimes the outer willpower is, we think we should, and then we kind of don't follow because we're addicted, or we're, in our, lazy lower self or whatever, so we resist what we think we should do, right? And then we get all tangled up in that dynamic of self-judgment because we're not doing what we should do, and then that does not help us choose from that inner will. That's a part of one of the negative consequences, of not taking it on, really. It's kind of a distraction.
Yeah. Well, I guess we could say, though, to put it in a nutshell, the right direction of inner will does have a a link to the manifestation of the life force within you.
Yeah.
And the wrong direction drains you of the life
Exactly.
force.
And you use, like it's a, you activate, you have to put energy, your own life force, into trying to make the thing happen. Again, it's
Yeah.
a control, it's a, an efforting that comes from the mask and not from the higher self, or the
Yeah.
natural flow of things. And so when, we can just keep recognizing, like, oh, I want to do something, but I didn't do it again. What happens is oftentimes, we feel so bad about ourselves because we didn't do what we thought we wanted to do or what we were trying to do. And then we want to not see that we didn't do it and not feel the consequence. We want to just kind of.
Just feeling bad about yourself is a draining experience. You know?
So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's kind
so
of interesting. I really like this discussion about the inner will and the outer will because I struggle with that all the time because I'm a will personality type. And so the way I think of it now, and it's cool that you brought in the idea of the bringing the life force in because I don't feel like the inner will is something that I, know very well because I think with my head and the outer will is so obvious to me, right? But the inner will is something that I find, to me, it feels so much less accessible, right? It's not accessible to my thoughts or my emotion. Like it's deeper, right? So I can't access it.
right,
So
it's
the way
part of
I
the
think of
involuntary system
it,
where your outer will is kind of the voluntary,
right.
like I can
So I
make.
think of it as setting the intention and then letting it sort of come from a different place. And, you can sort of watch that, but you can't really, it's hard to like steer that or whatever, because it kind of comes from a different place. So then, Frank, when you were saying how like, life affirming brings more energy of life and, life depleting. So it's almost like based on your will, whether it's in a positive direction or a negative direction, the energy that behind it is. So that's kind of like a key to whether or not you're on the right track, right? Am I feeling drained by this or am I feeling energized, But I really don't have a good sense of my inner will. It just seems so, ethereal or so, I don't know what the right word is, but I don't really know what it is. I know what my outer will is. My outer will is very strong, very strong will. But my inner will, I sort of have to feel into it because it's not obvious to me all the time.
It's
Well,
not in the same way that the outer will is, and we don't. I think we don't realize how powerful it is because it operates on a different plane,
Right.
the
right?
outer will is more of a selfish kind of will. The inner will is more of a selfless kind of
I
will.
don't think that's true. I think the outer will can be selfless also. The outer will can be selfish or selfless, and the inner will can be selfless or selfish. The
Most
inner
of the
will is
most
just like I
most of the
think of
way that
it.
I see the outer will is that it is coming from. It's like it's part of the mask. And so, if you are, like if you're doing, like from a place of your heart, you're probably going from your inner will, right? It doesn't mean that you don't have, action that can be taken, but you're not doing it out of a should, out of a mental idea about it. You're doing it because of a want, right? So one, it feels to me, one pushes you from behind the back of the heart chakra, and the other one pulls you forward from the front of the heart chakra. I desire, I want to give this, I want to do this, I want to, offer this or whatever. So it's, that's one level. And then if you're talking about, just sort of the inner prayer or the intention or the willingness, right? And the
That's how I
skillful
think of it. As more
will.
intent, the intention sets the will in motion, but I don't feel like I don't know. I mean, I guess you can sort of ride the wave or go with it, but it
I mean,
feels so different to me that, you know,
I think if your
hard to
outer will is
describe.
in service of the inner will, you're probably fine. But if your outer will is in service of some, mental idea about how things should be, and you're trying to make them that way out of outer control, needs, right?
But
Then
isn't that the point, is to try to align them, the inner will and the outer will? So that's, that's like the bliss, right? That above me, to the left, to the right.
yeah,
That if they're both in line, then you're in the right, you're in your groove of life or whatever. So,
I mean, to me, it is, like I used to struggle with this a lot. Like I was bulimic, I was, depressed. I would used to think that I needed to, use my will to make myself get up and do what I should be doing, or, you know, like all of those
forcing
things.
current,
And
yeah.
that never worked. And of course, my inability, the fact that will didn't work made me more and more depressed, because it was like this vicious circle that, like, and so somehow in the whole journey of it, like I gradually began to realize, I can't make myself do something, but I do a lot. Like when I want to do something, comes naturally, and it doesn't even feel like there's a will effort in it, from that outer will place. It's like it just kind of flows, right? So that's where, you know and also the universe will sort of align. So if I have willingness, or I make my prayer or my intention, then oftentimes the universe aligns to support that, which again, makes it less effortful, and it just
But
feels like it.
the inner will can also be a negative thing, because if your inner will is resistance, is resistant, then that's, where, if you don't, if you, and then you have to live the consequence and realize from a different place that, your want is not coming from a place of,
Right, well, that right
uh,
there is where you would have to, like look at, okay, so I have a no, right? My inner being is saying no, and that's part of my free will. And so I don't want to override it. I don't want to force it. I
right.
want to unravel it. I want to understand what that no
But
is.
isn't the inner, when the resistance and the inner no, isn't that the same as when the outer will is saying no, like it's not in alignment with truth, right?
Well,
I
sometimes it
really
can, a lot. Yeah, the guide is basically saying our no's are not in alignment ultimately with reality, right?
right,
But he's saying that we can't force a yes.
right.
That would be
But
a violation of
uncovering
free
the
will.
inner no, like sometimes we don't even know we have it, right? So,
Right. And so this is where I think part of it, he's saying, like we have to have the self-knowledge, right? We have to recognize what's going on in these places where, y- you know, we may be saying, there may be resistance that we're not even aware of, right? And so then
right,
we don't understand why things are unfolding the way they are, or why we're frustrated with this thing or not, and it just requires more, recognition that, there is self-creation involved. And a lot of times I've, like, why is the world working out this way? It's really because we need to, it's a squeeze, and we're being put in a situation that we have to work through, and part of doing that is feeling whatever it's bringing up, right? And not necessarily thinking that's the ultimate answer, or but that's part of the self-knowledge, right? And so
right,
we have to face into and be present to the story and what our experience is, but ideally, you know, listening to the spiritual meaning of it behind it all, like trusting that there is a deep transformational process and purpose that is happening as we encounter these, effects of our lives.
yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I don't know. My intuition tells me that inner will is more of like a faith based action. It's like it knows that that would be the right course of action. You know, it just knows it, and it does it without any uh, real deliberation, so to speak. It just knows that this is the right course.
Spontaneous, intuitive.
This is the right course of action. Yes, and the outer will is like, it's like, oh well, if I do this, maybe I'll get this, or I'm hoping for this outcome.
Strategic.
On and on and on. You know, there's like all this dialogue going on with the outer will, but the inner will doesn't have all that dialogue going on.
Yeah, I think that that's and I think that sometimes we need strategic plans and stuff like that as well, but I think that the impulse and the often the flow and the movement in it, it is guided, or Holy Spirit moving through us or something like that, that
Yeah,
feels different.
yeah.
So he says your immediate outer problems are only the effect of some cause which is hidden from you, but not so deeply that you could not so easily recognize it if you only practice what I say here. Then the connections will appear so clearly in front of your eyes that you'll be shocked at yourself for not having seen all of this in the past. Making the connection between your troubles and their causes, which your subconsciously yet deliberately had pushed out of your awareness, will have a blissful effect on you. It will make you happy the way only truth can. It will liberate latent powers and healing forces for your body and soul. If you experience this regularly, then you can be quite sure you are on the proper path. But because the temptation is always so great to put all this aside, you should be prepared to do battle with it anew every time. After a time, this temptation will cease, but at the beginning it will require considerable effort to guard against your lower self that tries to stifle the aspirations of your spirit. You may be the loser if your outer self allows all the excuses your lower nature furnishes. Yeah, and this kind of reminds me too, right? Like so we have oftentimes the spontaneous, guidance, or we have resistance to following it, right? Until the resistance can be removed, well, then, and so that's another application, and in some sense, it's the conscious, application, of the outer will in some sense, or at least the recognition, right? Oh, there's an issue there, right? That is blocking this, and then the outer intention and will to go explore it more fully, and understand what that block is, so that the natural spontaneous flow of communion and union and all of the divine qualities happens, right? But because this temptation is so great to put this aside, you should be prepared to battle with it anew every time. And after a time, it will cease, but at the beginning, it will require considerable efforts. You may be the loser if your outer self allows all the excuses your lower nature furnishes. And then he gives us, a kind of task or an exercise. He says, make a list of your faults. If you can think of only 2 or 3, then you have proof that you do not know yourself. And then you can avail yourself of the opportunity of self-purification and self-knowledge by doing what seems at first so difficult. Ask the people around you to tell you what your faults are. This will give you knowledge about yourself and will teach you the humility you need. For as long as it is difficult for you, it is a telling sign that you need just that very badly. If it is easy for you, if you do not feel resentment, resistance, or any kind of heaviness within, then it is not so important anymore. It does not matter what you try to tell others. It matters how you feel when someone tells you of your shortcomings. If you observe clinically what you feel when that happens, if you do not want to fool yourself about it, you will know where you stand spiritually. This is the only way you can become really detached, my friends. When you own your shortcomings in the eyes of others, you do not excuse me, when you own your shortcomings in the eyes of others do not matter anymore. Still get that. When your own shortcomings in the eyes of others do not matter anymore, then your humiliation does not matter anymore. Then you are detached, not when you avoid the things that bother you. So that's a pretty high bar for most of us, but that is one of the things that in this deeper healing of our pride, shame dynamic, and is coming into our true inner spiritual authority instead of using the idealized self-image and judgment and comparison, right? We really can feel much less defended and much less sort of accused or bad, when people, point out our faults or confront us with something. We actually welcome it. Thank you for, helping me see something that I didn't know about, or that I kind of know, but, I didn't know it was coming out and bothering you right now, or, it's like it's appreciated. And maybe it's something that somebody is projecting on you, but usually, in that space, you also know, the difference. And there's just no, either way, the guide says in another place, like when you're confronted, he says, it's either true or it's not true. And in either case, a defense is not necessary. So I think we're getting close to the end. We got a few more minutes here. Let's see if we can complete this section. So this is difficult, at least at the beginning, and perhaps not everyone is ready for it. Some may need more time, more knowledge, more dabbling at the fringes before they can really go on the path. But whoever does it will indeed become free. God will help you through all the further stages of self-realization, if these initial steps are taken. So my advice is this. First, think about what, in relationship to other people, seem most difficult for you. After you have found this, consider with what trend in you this might be connected. And then decide whether you are really ready to overcome whatever chains you in this way, not only for the sake of your own freedom, but for the sake of God, for the sake of your own spirit, your higher self, for the sake of your development, for the love you could only then give and receive, for your complete fulfillment. Are you ready to do that? How many of my friends here are? That's an interesting invitation, right? And then if you have decided with a big wholehearted yes, you will need your willpower, my dear ones. You will need willpower and self-discipline to battle all your faults, which can never happen by pushing them into the subconscious, by merely covering them up so that they do not show on the surface. For do not believe that something you are unaware of does not exist. The process of eliminating your faults, which is the next step after self-knowledge, is a very different one. Briefly, the process is this. Watch yourself first as you really are, without vanity, without wanting to be better or more than you are at this point. Simply take stock and get accustomed to seeing yourself where you really are and not where you want to be. Accept yourself, your temporary reality, for two reasons. One, you have to be unemotional and undisturbed about what you are before you can change yourself. This requires the new habit of seeing yourself clearly without any false motives, excuses, and blindness. And then number two, this will also teach you the necessary humility that is a major requirement of spiritual development and true detachment. Accepting yourself as you are does not mean that you should remain this way. In other words, it's not an excuse or, giving up. The ultimate goal must be to change the negative trend, but this cannot be done before you have accepted entirely the stage you are in. Thus observe yourself daily when and how your faults manifest, not only outwardly but also in your feelings. By observing your reactions, you will learn to ascertain how far you have to come toward accepting yourself without embellishment. After this stage is mastered, the next one can begin by meditating on what the opposite of any particular fault is, how you might react and feel if you had already achieved the transformation. If you do this faithfully for a while, asking God for inspiration, help, and strength, you will begin to feel differently. And this is part of, where I think the 12-step program, functions, that, a lot of our bad habits and our negativities and stuff are kind of addictions, right? And so there's this way that the ego gets in and tries to, use its will to make it happen. And that's where we get all lost. So, again, we have to ask God, like recognize we can't do it by ourselves. And we can align with it, and then that's all. We can make that inner choice and we can do our best, but it's with God that this happens, and not by ourselves. And with that, kind of humbling and request, then the influx and the support from spirit comes in, which we need, and we need to feel, and we need to understand that connection and that availability. So again, even like this place of thinking we have to do it all by ourselves, is kind of a way that we get into pride, or we get into separation. And this other place is more humbly recognizing, where we are, and that we want to change, and that's our choice, our free will choice. But it's God that does the healing. It's God that allows the deeper inner change to actually manifest. And we have to, keep using that strength within us, that God strength within us, each time, and use the God forgiveness within us each time we might, fail or fall again into negativity of some kind. It says your new inner reactions will leave you so free, make you feel so wonderful. You may also meditate on how each of your particular faults is a direct hindrance to the unfoldment of love. For each fault is just that. It blurs the love force in the soul. I like that, right? Like thinking of it that way gives us, again, this inner longing and intention, to bring forth our love fully, because that's who we really are. That's what we really want in our deepest nature. And if you proceed in this way, God will inspire and guide you, and you can be quite sure of that. As I said, this is a difficult path, but blessed are those who take it, who have the courage and the wisdom to do so. Just checking to see. Yeah, we're almost done with this question. I know, my friends, that I have given you strong medicine. No one likes to hear these things. It would be so much more pleasant to hear what is easy or is impersonal. But unfortunately, that would not correspond to truth. And since I am a spirit of truth, of the world of God, I have to give you truth, whether it is comfortable or not. Yet bitter as the medicine may be, I think that if you open your hearts, you will feel the love I have for each one of you. Love cannot come from any other side but the side of God's world. And you should never be grateful to anyone else but God. Well, okay, whether it is through me or another spirit of the world of God, no matter how much you may be helped, no created being is anything without God. The higher developed a creature, the less it will want honor and admiration. This is due only to the Creator, without whom we are nothing. This applies to us spirits just as much as to you humans. When you are accomplishing something, whatever it may be, realize that it is only through the grace of God that you can do it, not through yourself. By yourself, you are nothing, and the highest created being in existence, Christ himself, has said so time and again. So, I'm going to probably wind up with that one. Let's see if there's a closing here. And just wanting to, maybe check in is, yeah, Jasmine, you still with us? How are you doing with all of this? Haven't heard from you all this
Yeah,
time.
I'm still with you guys. I think trying to take everything in, but I'm kind of having currently, what I'm having trouble is sort of in tuning to myself and emotions and my reactions. And I was hoping to see, if today I could learn something. I think I did, but still a little confused. I'll probably have to read it over again.
Yeah, this is a kind of
Yeah.
complex and deep lecture, and without a lot of other, you're fairly new to the path, so
Yeah.
it's going to be harder for you to kind of
I did
comprehend.
have, one question. Like, would you say like is a good practice to have, like even daily, to sort of try and connect, to the inner will, I suppose. I think I have
Okay,
a
so
yeah.
I mean, there's different practices for sure, and what he's suggesting here in a way is to use your inner will to, kind of examine or have self-knowledge, right? So does that
Hmm.
feel like a good goal for yourself, like to see, like here he was inviting us to be more aware of our faults. So
Right. Yeah, I think that's I'll try that exercise actually. I'll see how that goes. But I think I don't really know myself that well, like self-awareness. So maybe that's the struggle that I'm having. So
yeah, and like we deepen, and so yeah, just explore that a little. And the other thing that he gives us as kind of an important practice is what he calls daily review. And it
hmm.
just suggests that, we kind of make two columns across the page, and we review every day, like the circumstances in our day that maybe created, some cringe factor, some disharmony,
Hmm.
some, reaction inside of us, right? And then we just kind of note it by, writing what the event was and then writing simply what the reaction is. And he says, if you do this over like a week or so, kind of every day, you can also discern patterns out of it,
Hmm.
and certain similarities and certain types of things. And that can also help us find areas to explore, like, to get to know a little more what's going on inside of us.
Yeah,
So,
I
and I
think I'll
think it's
give
a
that a
lecture,
try.
that includes daily review in the title, or you can search that in the search
Okay.
and, come up with his instructions in that as well.
Okay, thanks, Darlene. I think that's a good practice. I'll try and do that.
Okay. So he says, in very closing, this is a vast subject, new in many respects. Don't buy your vision. Think, uh, do not let your unconscious emotions play tricks by blurring your judgment, and be careful of that, because we don't, it can be harmful to ourselves in this judgment, and it's sort of a natural place we want to go. So when we go into exploring our faults and all of that, the self-acceptance piece, can, and if you notice that you're not accepting it, then you want to be curious about that. There's self-knowledge to be gained. Why am I not accepting, you know that I'm imperfect, right? Who is it that wants me to be so perfect? What death do I die if I'm imperfect, or whatever, like that, so we can keep delving and excavating a little deeper. So, in closing, he says, God's blessings to every one of you. Take this blessing and awareness so that it may help you in your decisions, that it may strengthen you to recognize the will of God and act accordingly. Be in peace and be in God. Okay, so I guess next time we will conclude with the plan of salvation, uh, of this kind of series. Um, so, thank you, everybody, for good discussion and exploration of this lecture.
Thank you, Darlene.
And
Thank you,
Happy New
Darlene.
Year. I guess we
Thanks,
have
Thank
Darlene.
you.
Happy New Year and
Happy New Year. Yeah.
Happy New Year, everybody. Yeah.
Happy as it can be, yeah.
Happy
Happy
as
New
it
Year.
can. Yeah.
2022 seems to be a real shaking
2022
doozy
is
so far.
it's gonna be better.
I don't
God, it
know.
can't get any
I
worse.
hope
It's
so.
gotta go better.
They say it's the year about relationship, right? And
Ah,
so like in our situation where we had, like on the third, this huge snowstorm and everything kind of, challenged us, like I saw where, it also brought the community together, and our recognition of how much we need to be comfortable and survive in this world. We need each other, right?
Yeah.
So, so I think maybe that may be some of the lessons for this year. So, okay. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
See you in a couple of
Pleasure.
weeks.
Bye.
Bye.